Hey tunlain Mizorama Aizola Will Graham Crusade kan nei beka heta hian kan chat angin Billy Graham atupa Will Graham aron kala vaivakona crusade nei lai me kan ne he tukin zinga choni zinga hian ma kom na hun toite kan nei theidona hello mom hleni we thank you so much for making this time for us. I want to begin by asking you how many William Franklin Grahams there are in your family.
Well, there's quite a few of us.
Yeah.
My name is actually William Franklin Graham the fourth. And I go by Will. That's my nickname,
right.
Will. My father's William Franklin Graham III.
And he goes by Franklin.
He goes by his middle name. My grandfather, most people don't realize this, is William Franklin Graham Jr.
Oh, he's Junior.
He's a junior,
right.
But the world knows him as
Billy
Graham. That's his nickname. And then, so I'm really actually named after my great-grandfather, which
right.
is Billy's father.
Right.
He was a dairy farmer, and his name was William Franklin Graham Sr., and he went by the name Frank
right.
Graham. And now I have a son, and his name is William Franklin Graham V, but we've run out of nicknames. We don't have any other nicknames,
yeah.
so I came up with the idea of calling him Quinn.
5.
Quinn means 5.
Right,
and so
right.
that's his nickname's Quinn.
That's really interesting. Does that ever pose a problem in the family? Like out here when we do this, when we raise voices, we tend to use our long formal names. Does it ever happen in your family?
Well, no. When we're in trouble, we know who's at fault.
Right. That's kind of interesting. So you grew up being Billy Graham's grandson and Franklin Graham's son.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like? Did you always know that Billy Graham had this huge impact in the Christian world, especially?
Well, when you're real young, you don't realize that. I mean, the only thing I saw when I was growing up was I saw him as my grandfather.
Right.
You know, he was my granddad. I mean, I enjoyed being around him. And it wasn't probably until I was about 5 or 6 years old that I started to realize that there was something different about my grandfather. In other words, other people knew about him.
Right.
And then, and even through high school and elementary school, I understood that my grandfather was a lot different. But it probably didn't see the full magnitude until I got to my university days. And I went to a Christian university,
right.
and I saw the impact that my grandfather had on spiritual formation in the 20th century around the world. And so that's probably when I understood it the best, is when I got to the university. But you know, when you're real young, you just see your granddad, you just go jump on his lap,
yeah.
and he gives you a snack or something like that. I mean, he was a grandfather to me.
So as with regard to his ministry, you would say that it was in your university days that you completely understood what was going on in that?
Well, at least for his ministry, yes. And I believe that God was calling me to ministry. I just didn't know how. You know,
right.
if I was going to be a preacher, like a pastor of a local church, if I was going to be a missionary, or if I was going to be an evangelist. I didn't know exactly what, but I knew that God was wanting me to go into ministry.
I've always known that.
I've known for a very long time.
Right.
And it wasn't because I was Billy Graham's grandson. A lot of people say, well, it's in your genetic genes, so that's that's expected. But that doesn't matter. It's a matter if God calls you. And I felt like at a very young age that God started planting a seed in my heart to go into ministry. And but it wasn't later in life, in my teenage years, that God actually called me to go into ministry, even though I didn't know exactly what type of ministry, but He was going to call me into ministry.
And now the ministry that you have, this evangelistic ministry, when did you realize it? How long have you been going on with this?
I've been doing what we call like our crusade evangelism. Even before I came to work for the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, I was actually a pastor of a local church.
Oh, you were?
Back in North Carolina,
right.
Back in the United States. And while I was pastoring a church, I started doing evangelism for the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association.
Before you actually came into the association?
That's right. They had asked me to come and do this, and so I would take some time off and
right.
go help the organization, the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. And so I started doing some of my very first crusades in Canada.
Oh.
And so I did my very first outreach in 2004. And every year since then, I've been doing crusades around the world.
That's wonderful. Now, I just want to go back to your grandparents, your grandmother. We have read some of her books as well. What would you say was her contribution to your granddad's ministry as such?
Well, there's not enough time for
Huge.
that. I mean, there would be no Billy Graham without a Ruth Graham. For a number of reasons. One was my grandfather was able to travel around the world because my grandmother took care of the home. She raised the children. She raised them. She spoke spiritual direction into their life. And she did all that. And she did it with such grace and honor. I mean, she was never mad that Billy was traveling. She knew that was part of the calling that she had, was to take care of the house so that Billy Graham didn't have to worry about it when he came home. She was also the one that would critique my grandfather and give my grandfather advice. When my grandfather one day was asked to be a vice president of the United States, to run for office, and my grandfather was thinking about it, she went in there and chewed him out and said, no preacher should ever stoop to be a politician.
Wow.
You know, she's saying, you know, God's called you to a higher office. Don't, you know, being a preacher is a far better position of being vice president or president of the United States. It's the highest calling in life, is to be a preacher of the gospel. And so she would, she counseled my grandfather. My grandfather has always said the greatest Christian he has ever known was his wife Ruth.
That's wonderful.
And so he depended on her constantly. I mean, I cannot stress how much he was, that my grandmother was an important part in my grandfather's life.
That's wonderful. That's the first I've heard of that. I mean, the running for the vice presidentship and everything, that's completely inspiring.
Well, another time the president was sitting down, was asking my grandfather, you know, at a different time, who should be vice president? Who should he ask to be vice president? And he started thinking, well, and my grandmother kicked him under the table, and you know, and said, you know, he said, and she told the president, Mr. President, Billy Graham can talk to you about spiritual issues, but politics he will not answer you.
Wow.
And so the president said, okay, Mrs. Graham, I understand.
I
And
respect that.
I respect that. So, but my grandmother kicked my granddaddy under the table, said, you're not going to dive into politics, stay out of it, just be a preacher of the gospel.
That's wonderful. But Billy Graham, as we all know, has been a source of inspiration with the 9/11, with the Oklahoma bombing. We have heard him out here as well, and we still remember him. And whatever comes out of him, we believe comes out of God, and that he's received those, and we are so inspired by him. And we want you to get that message back to him as well. And coming back to your ministry, let's say, you've been doing this from 2004. When did you actually feel that, you know, this is your calling? I mean, you were a pastor before. And
I was, and the first time I was, our Canadian organization called me and said, Will, we want you to come up, we're going to start a new evangelism initiative here in Canada, and we want you to come and do it. And I was like, listen, I enjoy being a pastor. I want to be a pastor. I'm not into evangelism. I mean, I believe it's important, but at the same time, I was wanting to focus on what God had called me to, the local church. But I felt like God was leading me to go up there. Even though I personally didn't want to go, God was telling me to go.
Right.
And so I went. And God just started opening up, you know, doors for me, and was confirming it in my life. And then later on in 2006, God revealed to me a passage of Scripture in the Bible that just spoke to my heart and told me that, you know, this is what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my life. And so it was a humbling and powerful moment in my life, and one that I'll never forget.
Right. Can you share with us the scripture verse?
I've never shared it.
Oh,
I keep it to myself.
Right, right.
So that's
it's
something
so
kind of like when Mary
right.
pondered the things in her heart
In her
about
heart.
her son.
Right.
This is the one thing I ponder on for myself.
That's great. That's really powerful, though, in a way. And you've had these crusades for some time. I mean, the celebrations, we've changed it to crusade here because it's easier for us to understand. But you've had this for some time. And what is your main expectation? What do you pray for when you go for these?
Well, I pray, it sounds awkward, but I pray for one person. And I pray that there be one person that comes to know Christ. Now, I hope that many will come to know Christ.
Right.
but I pray that there'll be one that maybe like here in Aswell that will come to know Christ, and he'll come up to be a great evangelist or great preacher in the community and lead thousands of his fellow neighbors to Christ. You know, he may be a young student right now or a young athlete or something like that, and he has a huge influence, but God's going to touch his life or her life. It doesn't matter, boy or girl, but God's going to use that person to reach other Mizzos here in this area. And so I've been praying that God would just bring that one person, allow that person to come to know Christ, whether it's a boy or girl, but one person that's going to rise up in this community here and teach others about Christ.
Right.
And so that's what my prayer is. Now I pray that there be many people that come to know Christ, but I pray for one.
That's wonderful. And how did you first hear about Mizoram, the BGEA, or you personally?
Well, it was my friend Robert Cumville, who's
Right.
a dear friend of my grandfather's, an associate evangelist with us. He's the one that told me about Mizoram and the opportunity to come here. And so this is my first time, so I've had a wonderful experience.
That's wonderful. When was this? When did you first hear about this?
This would have been about last year.
Oh, okay.
About a year ago,
Right.
Robert Cumville and I were talking, and he said, "Well, there's been an invitation for you to come to Mizoram." And so I was like, I don't even know where that is.
Where is that?
We're in, you know, India's a big country.
I know.
And so, and I don't know where all the states are.
Of
I know
course
where
not.
a few of them are. And he was saying, well, it's here in the Northeast, and it's a very remote place, and it'd be a beautiful chance to share the gospel. And so he's the one that told me about this place.
It's wonderful. We're so glad that you finally made it here.
Yeah, well, thank you.
One thing that I wanted to ask you, or two things actually. We've seen you behind the scenes because we've been following you these past few days. We've seen you and your team praying for each other when you're entering the venue, when you're leaving. And I want to ask you about that. What do you think is the power of prayer in those times?
Well, the power of prayer is a secret behind evangelism. And because there's nothing that we can do. We have to pray that God's Spirit will move and call people. And so we spend a lot of time in prayer. That's even before, that's what I spend my mornings doing.
Yeah.
Studying the Bible and just praying. God help me to communicate. Before I came to this interview, I was praying for this interview. So that I could represent the Lord Jesus Christ with the best of my ability. And so prayer is very much essential and imperative for evangelism. We cannot do it without it. And that's something that my grandfather has taught me.
Before we end, is there anything else you would like to add to this?
No, I just want to ask you to continue to pray. Especially pray for the ones who made decisions, that they'll get plugged into a local church and they'll start to grow in their Christian faith.
Right.
And we want to see Aswell changed, not because of Will Graham, but because God wants to move among His people.
That's wonderful. Will Graham atukin singa kom na hun toite kan nei thea hei chun nuwa hei engkhom le mei tur kan ni wangin hun rei tak kan mang theilawa maro chu tuna soi angkhan tong trai na a kan shat pui reng hi adu em ema chu ti turin thlir tu te zong zong po kan in cha le pok kan ni e